It's terrible. It seems Mom has fallen down the stairs at home and gotten hurt. No sooner had I pressed the call button than my husband, Tony, spoke in a panicked voice. What? That's why. Mom's been injured. I'm going to go back to my parents' house for a while to take care of her. I'm leaving the house stuff to you. I thought, my mother-in-law? But she's right in front of me. Right now, I'm happily having coffee with my mother-in-law at her house. What is Tony talking about? As I was puzzled, she gestured to me with her eyes and pressed her index finger to her lips with a shoe. I nodded okay and put my smartphone on speaker mode between my mother-in-law and me. Hey, is it really true that Mom got hurt? Then, I'll rush over to Mom's place right now. I made sure to confirm with my mother-in-law clearly. What? No, it's okay, it's okay. You don't get along with her, right? Leave Mom's care to me. By then, not wanting to continue the conversation any longer, Tony abruptly hung up the phone. I was dumbfounded, and my mother-in-law, who had been holding back her laughter, burst into laughter as soon as the call ended. Let's see how things go for a while. My husband, Tony, completely disinterested in me now, still doesn't know about the secret relationship between my mother-in-law and me. I could envision his pale face in the future, and I couldn't help but smile. My name is Kathy. I have been working as a caregiving assistant since graduating from high school, and I'm now in my 50s. Tony was my high school classmate, and we got married in our late 20s. In the early days of our marriage, I had a problem. It was with his mother, Dorothy. His parents' house was nearby, so I ran into her frequently at the supermarket or when taking out the trash. Naturally, I always greeted her with a smile, but she always ignored me. Having been a well-educated career woman who traveled the world in her younger days, she seemed to disdain me, a high school graduate, as unsuitable for her son. However, I later realized this was a misunderstanding. One day, Dorothy confronted me about why I frequently left home late at night. From her probing gaze, I realized she suspected infidelity. You're always out late at night. I feel sorry for my son. Mom, it's not like that. Actually, the elderly I care for often wander off at night, and their families ask me to help look for them, so I end up out late. When I explained the situation honestly, Dorothy blushed and sincerely apologized for her mistake. I'm really sorry for being rude. I just assumed you were cheating. Seeing Dorothy apologize deeply, I also realized that I had misunderstood her. I shared a story that inspired me to pursue a career in caregiving, and she smiled warmly and looked at me kindly. I once escorted an elderly woman with dementia to the police station when I was a high school student. Seeing how kindly the caregiving assistant spoke to her, I decided I wanted to be a wonderful woman like that, and I chose the path of caregiving. I'm really proud to have become your mother-in-law. Now that I know Dorothy isn't the type to judge people based on education or background, we spend enjoyable times together, grabbing lunch or coffee whenever we can. But problems never cease. About 3 years into our marriage, Tony suddenly started being cold to me. I thought he must be tired from work, so I tried to keep things cheerful. Welcome home. They're showing that movie we watched on our first date on TV today. Want to watch it together? It had become a tradition to prepare popcorn and watch it together whenever it aired on TV. I'm tired of it already. Sorry, but I have work left to do. Tony avoided eye contact and disappeared into his workroom. When I passed by his room after taking a bath, I heard laughter from inside, Tony's laughter, which had become rare recently. I thought, is it an online meeting? But it sounds too fun. I tried not to think too deeply about it and went to my bedroom alone. However, by ignoring these occasional feelings of discomfort, the gap between Tony and me had grown irreparably deep. Previously, on our anniversaries and my birthdays, Tony always remembered to send flowers and gifts, but now he doesn't come home, claiming overtime, and sometimes reeks of alcohol when he does. Why do you smell like alcohol when you said you were working overtime? I demanded. Tony nonchalantly replied that a sudden business dinner had come up, clicking his tongue in annoyance. Gradually, our nights together dwindled, and even if I snuggled up to him in bed, Tony would twist uncomfortably and turn his back to me. My work isn't like your squad caregiving job. I use my brain and get tired. Tony spat out without looking at me. I thought, squad? Is that what he thinks of my job? I take pride in my caregiving work. It's a fulfilling job where I can help people. And while I don't do it just for thanks, it feels good to be appreciated. However, caregiving is not all fun and games, it's mostly tough. And I'm exhausted after work, studying between work and house chores to improve my skills. As anger welled up inside me, I also felt sad to be belittled about my job. But I hated for fights to spoil the atmosphere at home, so I bit my lip and held back. I thought, Tony must just be tired, he doesn't mean it. I kept telling myself this and continued to endure. But my patience was in vain, and the situation worsened. Tony claimed to be working overtime or on business trips, and meals at home became exceedingly rare. When he did eat at home, he was distant, mechanically shoveling food into his mouth. How's the seasoning on the turkey? Should it be stronger? Tony didn't respond, as if he hadn't heard my voice. Hey, listen. What? When I asked about the seasoning again. Turkey? Oh, it doesn't matter as long as it's edible, Tony said with an indifferent face, fiddling with his phone out of my sight. Then, suddenly standing up, he said he had a call from work and left the food to lock himself in his workroom. Tony didn't come out of the room again, and I sighed, looking at the half-eaten meal he had left. It was expensive fish. I had splurged, hoping to energize him after his recent string of late nights. If he wasn't going to eat, I wished he would tell me. I wrapped the leftovers and put them in the fridge for my lunch the next day. The next day, Tony staggered home drunk at 2 a.m. I had reached my breaking point. Hey, can't you at least let me know if you're going to be late? It wasn't much to ask for, a simple message would have sufficed. Some urgent work came up, and I'm tired, so stop nagging. Tony snapped, clumsily kicking off his shoes and dramatically covering his ears with his palms. Nagging? I have to prepare meals and plan my own schedule, you know. Plan? You're always just cooking the same stuff. Who do you think works to afford this nice house anyway? His words, belittling me while drunk, left me speechless. This house was actually built by his mother, Dorothy, and Tony hadn't paid a penny towards it. Besides utilities, which were paid by direct debit, I covered everything else from my salary. Initially, Tony would give me some cash, but he gradually started avoiding the subject. I nearly spoke up, but bit my lip to avoid hurting Tony's pride. Tony seemed to guess what I wanted to say and glared at me, frowning deeply. His right arm moved, and I instinctively braced for a blow. But then he suddenly laughed and gave me a condescending smirk. Well, your poor parents didn't contribute a penny, did they? The words were as hurtful as physical violence. What are you saying? I was too angry to articulate my thoughts properly as he mocked the parents who had raised me lovingly. Indeed, my family wasn't wealthy, but they had offered to help, which Tony had refused. I remembered the mixed expressions of gratitude and apology on my parents' faces back then. I'm happy just to be married to Kathy. Back then, I proudly watched Tony as he gently embraced me, thinking I had chosen the right person. Yet now, leaving me dumbfounded. He spat out, "I'm taking a bath," and stormed off to the room. From that day on, Tony started staying at a hotel more than once a week, even though he wasn't on a business trip, and he never informed me beforehand. He claimed it was a busy period at work. But this busy period had been going on for over half a year now. As usual, I was having breakfast alone in the morning when Tony called. "Hey, I'm at the station now. Bring me a change of underwear and a shirt." "What?" "I have to visit a client before I go to the office today." "I can't." "Fine, then come within 10 minutes. Tony hung up abruptly, without any regard for my schedule. Had I become more of a servant than a wife in his eyes? It was already 8 a.m. I left my breakfast, quickly packed a change of clothes in a paper bag, and ran out without even putting on makeup. My hair disheveled. I arrived at the station gasping for breath, where Tony took the paper bag without a word of thanks. "Wait here," he said arrogantly, pointing to the ground as he entered the station restroom to change. When I checked my phone, it was nearly 8:30 a.m. I had promised to be at my client's place by 9 a.m. Tony finally came out of the restroom after changing. The shirt and underwear he had been wearing were crumpled up in the paper bag he handed back to me. Tony glanced at my face, clicked his tongue, and scoffed. "At least put on some makeup, won't you?" He mocked my disheveled appearance and hurriedly walked towards the ticket gate. I thought, "It's your fault." I wanted to shout at Tony's back, but I had no time for arguments. I shook my hair again and ran to my client's house. After finishing my work and returning home, I took Tony's laundry out of the bag, and a sweet scent filled the air. At first, I thought it was the hotel soap, but the fragrance was too strong, it had to be perfume. When I told Tony about it after he came home, he visibly panicked. "Ah. That. It's just the perfume of the woman next to me on the crowded train." As he nervously rambled on about things I hadn't even asked, my suspicion only deepened. The next day, Tony came home unusually early, holding a pink paper bag. "Actually, I've been looking for a perfume that suits you recently. So maybe that's why my shirt smelled." "Why? It's not even my birthday." Confusion overtook any sense of delight, and I inadvertently frowned. "What? I can't give you something even if it's not a special day?" Ungrateful. Tony seemed displeased by my reaction, threw his bag on the sofa, and sulked. A few days later, while I was having coffee at Dorothy's house on a weekend, Tony, who had said he was working, called shortly after leaving the house. "It's terrible. It seems Mom has fallen down the stairs at home and gotten hurt." He spoke loudly, so his voice leaked from the smartphone. I thought, my mother-in-law? But she's right in front of me. As I was puzzled, Dorothy gestured with her eyes and shushed me by pressing her index finger to her lips. I placed the smartphone on speaker mode between Dorothy and myself. "Hey, Did Mom really get hurt? I pressed Tony for clarification, wanting Dorothy to hear him clearly. That's what I'm saying. Then, I'll rush to the family home right now. As I said this, Tony replied in a flustered voice. What? You don't get along with her, do you? Leave her to me. I'm going to the family home to take care of her for a while. I'm more qualified for caregiving. I said it's fine. By then. Not wanting to continue the conversation, Tony hung up abruptly. Dorothy, who had been holding back her laughter, burst out laughing once the call ended. Let's see how it goes for a while. Since Dorothy suggested it, I decided to watch the situation for a while too. A week later, Tony came home to pick up some clothes. Hey, how's Mom doing? I pretended to be genuinely concerned and asked Tony in a nurturing tone. The surgery went well, and she'll be discharged soon. I mercilessly pointed out the contradiction in Tony's words. What? Weren't you supposed to be on home care? Tony made a face that said he'd been caught and started making excuses at a rapid pace. Yeah. That's right. He was rushed to the hospital with a sudden illness. Had surgery, and then fell and sprained his ankle during rehab at the hospital. Stupid, right? What? A sudden illness? It wasn't an injury? I didn't ease up on my questioning. Sweat started to bead on Tony's face. Recently, he had been quite subdued, but now he looked pathetically flustered. And I couldn't help but burst out laughing. Then, the door of the next room swung open with force. Let's hear more about that, said Dorothy, who had been waiting in the next room, crossing her arms as she appeared. Tony, caught off guard by his mother's sudden entrance, just gaped, opening and closing his mouth like a fish. What? I thought you two didn't get along. It seemed Tony still believed that his mother and I were not on good terms. No wonder, as there had been virtually no real conversation between Tony and me for years. I had tried several times to tell Tony that any misunderstandings with Dorothy had been cleared up, and we were now like friends. It was Tony who had been avoiding conversation with me. Suddenly, Tony seemed to have an idea and exclaimed, Mom? That was Kathy's misunderstanding. Yeah. It was Mr. Owen, a senior colleague who slipped and severely injured himself at home. His excuse, unfit for an adult professional, made me look at him with a cold eye. Then, I casually pulled out my smartphone from my pocket and tapped the screen. Leave Mom to me. I'm going to the family home to take care of her for a while. By then, I had recorded a phone call from Tony from a week ago, starting midway through the call. I clearly hear Mom though. Watching Tony turn pale as his big lie was exposed, Dorothy and I couldn't hold back our laughter any longer. Then Dorothy abruptly stopped laughing, furrowed her brow, and took a deep breath. You. Which mom have you been taking care of? Tony, scolded by his mother, collapsed in shock. He had once told me that he had rarely been scolded by his mother. Looking up at Dorothy with teary eyes, Tony seemed just like a little child. What? You hated Kathy too, didn't you? You always belittled her caregiving job. Tony tried to shift the blame to Dorothy in a near-crying voice. That's because I saw Kathy leaving the house at night and suspected she was cheating. I would never belittle her caregiving work. Dorothy began to explain a connection between herself and me that Tony still didn't know about. The elderly woman I had taken to the police station in high school, which had inspired her to pursue caregiving, was actually Dorothy's mother and Tony's grandmother. When I had first visited Tony's home to formally announce our marriage, the grandmother had already passed away. So I hadn't realized who she was. What? Tony exclaimed in a stunned voice. I have nothing but gratitude for Kathy. I respect such a kind-hearted person like her. I would never disdain or mock her. Though Tony had been looking meek earlier, he suddenly looked up and glared at me. Damn it. I married you thinking that someday you'd take care of my parents. Because you work in caregiving. If not for that, why would I choose a poor high school graduate like you? Saying this, Tony threw socks and a tie from his bag at me in a fit of childish anger. Overwhelmed by his immaturity, I was more appalled than angry. Dorothy stepped between Tony and me, shielding me. You shouldn't judge people by their backgrounds. I stopped Dorothy from raising her hand against Tony and gestured to her to look at the time. It's about time, Mom. This isn't the end, Tony. Right, let's get to the main point then. Tony defiantly rolled his eyes and clicked his tongue. Is there still more? Just then, the doorbell rang as if on cue. Hello from Flower Garden. A lively female voice was heard, and as I opened the front door, a young woman in her early 20s stood there holding a bouquet. I invited her inside. Confused but following along, she gasped in surprise when she saw Tony sitting on the floor. What? Tony. Yikes. Tony made a strangled noise upon seeing the woman's face. The florist looked back and forth between Tony and us, her expression full of suspicion. What's going on here? As the woman questioned Tony, he screamed as if in agony and fled into the next room, slamming and locking the door behind him. I don't know you. It's a case of mistaken identity. We are strangers to each other. From his clumsy tone, it was clear Tony was in considerable confusion. What? It's me, Alyssa. We were together just this morning. Ha. No, it's a mistake. Alyssa, who had introduced herself, called out to Tony through the door. But he had clammed up, probably cowering and covering his ears, waiting for things to cool down. Seeing my husband reduced to such a pathetic state, I was beyond anger or sadness. What do you mean? He's definitely my fiancé. What have you done to him? Alyssa's anger was directed not at the fleeing Tony, but at Dorothy and me. Actually, Dorothy and I had known about Alyssa beforehand. The day after Tony made a false call about his mother being injured, we became certain of his affair and headed to a detective agency. Evidence of Tony's infidelity was easily found, and the other party was the clerk at the florist's, where he used to buy flowers for my birthday. The detective suggested that Alyssa might not know Tony was married. She seemed happy talking to colleagues about her upcoming marriage. Dorothy and I had pondered how to convince Alyssa that Tony was married, and how to corner the argumentative Tony effectively. Yesterday, after Tony said he'd come to pick up some things, I immediately contacted Dorothy and hurriedly reserved a bouquet at the florist where Alyssa worked. Alyssa, I'm sorry to involve you in this. I am Tony's wife, Kathy. I apologized to Alyssa for involving her in the plan, and told her politely that I was Tony's wife. What? Don't lie. I'm going to marry him. Please don't interfere. Seeing Alyssa's disbelief reinforced my conviction that carrying out this plan was the right decision. Words alone wouldn't have convinced her that Tony was already married. I showed Alyssa a wedding album I had prepared on the table. She gasped sharply, hesitantly took the album, and slowly turned the pages. After returning the album to me, Alyssa bit her lip and clenched her fists, holding back tears. Suddenly, she apologized to me. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Seeing such an honest and good person being deceived intensified my anger towards Tony again. Tony! Come out here. Alyssa yelled towards the room Tony had fled into, pounding on the door with her clenched fists. Despite everything, Tony continued to remain silent. Alyssa had even introduced Tony as her fiancé to her father. She mentioned that her father was pleased upon hearing the name of Tony's company, believing it was reputable. My father is the president of a client company that does business with yours. You might know it as Morris Trading. Morris Trading was a well-known major corporation. When Alyssa mentioned the company name, the door to the room Tony had escaped into burst open. What? I didn't know about this. Tony emerged pale-faced, tripped on the carpet, crawled on the floor, and clung to Alyssa's legs. Alyssa, I'm sorry. Tony grabbed her hands, spouting insincere lines like, I love you. And you're the only one for me. I was planning to divorce her when I met you. It's true. Tony jutted his chin towards me. It was clear he meant me when he said her. What? I can't believe this. I'm glad I didn't end up marrying a scumbag like you. Alyssa turned back to me. Thank you for telling me, Kathy. Alyssa, who had been standing up for me, brushed off Tony's hands as if shaking off dirt. So be it. I really wanted to marry Alyssa, but if she hates me, we'll break up. Despite the dire situation, Tony seemed relieved. As if he thought he could end it here. He was despicably cowardly. However, Alyssa's next words plunged him into despair. What? You think this is over? I will never forgive you for deceiving not just me, but my father too. I will sue for compensation. So no. Tony crawled on the floor, then clung to his mother's legs. Help me. Mom. Dorothy, like Alyssa, shook him off. I've pampered you too much, because you had no father. Hurting a young woman and the kind Kathy, this time. I must teach you a proper lesson. So, I don't have the money to pay the compensation. Tony, though well paid, had almost no savings. Recently, multiple notices from consumer loans had been frequently arriving for Tony. I had noticed that his spending had become extravagant over the years. He had custom-made expensive suits and shopped at overseas boutiques, often visiting hair salons, probably to impress the young Alyssa. Alyssa, who had been involved with such a despicable man, glared at him angrily. I will contact you through a lawyer. Don't ever show up in front of me again. Alyssa spoke firmly to Tony and nodded at me before leaving. As we watched her leave, Dorothy and I turned back to Tony. When Dorothy called his name, Tony visibly flinched. You're just like your father. His looks and his deeds. Once, Dorothy's husband, Tony's father, had cheated with a younger woman, fathered a child, and eventually abandoned the family. Dorothy and I left the lifeless shell of a man that was Tony behind, and walked out of the house. I couldn't bear to live under the same roof with Tony anymore and decided to stay with Dorothy for a while. The next day, I received a call from Alyssa. She had seen my mobile number on the flower reservation slip and decided to call. Alyssa's father had promptly called Tony's company to complain. He even threatened to terminate their business dealings. But senior executives from both companies desperately tried to calm him down. Although they managed to avoid terminating the deal, Tony was demoted and sent to a subsidiary in a rural area of Southeast Asia. Alyssa successfully sued Tony and obtained the desired compensation. Kathy, I'm truly sorry. It's only you for me, come with me. Covered in debt from alimony and credit loans, and ultimately forced to go alone to a rural area abroad, Tony, with tears and snot running down his face, grabbed my hand and pleaded for reconciliation. I have my caregiving job, so I can't follow you. Make sure you work hard and pay Alyssa the compensation. I left the divorce papers on the table, packed my things, and left the house. I didn't ask for any compensation for myself. I didn't want to burden Dorothy, and I could live well enough on my own earnings. Months later, I passed the certified caregiver exam. Dorothy, no longer my mother-in-law but still rejoicing as if it were her own success. And I continued to enjoy our chats and coffee breaks. We were bound by a deep friendship that transcended our former familial ties. Occasionally, we reflected on the past. But we both looked forward without dwelling on it, enjoying our new lives.